Danny and the Boys by Robert Traver. This book consists of 22 stories and is 254 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Rugged is the word for Danny McGinnis, and his boys are equally rugged. They all live together in a little logging shack in Hungry Hollow, not far from the iron mining town of Chippewa on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The hollow, once heavily timbered with white pine, has all been logged off now, and the main activities of Danny and his cronies center on fishing and hunting, tail spinning, moonshining, and periodic rampages through the Chippewa saloons and the local hotel. Danny was the first to hole up in Hungry Hollow after a departing lumber baron left nothing there but tree stumps and a swamp. Big Buller Bodine, in an alcoholic daze, joined Danny in 1914. His health returned when Danny put him on a liquid diet of local home brew. Gentle Timmy Pasco came next, gassed veteran of World War I, who resolved never to punch a goddamn clock again. He spent most of his time catching trout and fixing everything in camp that could possibly get broken. 10 years later, the backwash of the Depression cast up Taconite Nick Vedder and Swan Kellstrom, two bewildered refugees from the outer world, who found final acceptance only after 6 months of cutting Hungry Hollow firewood. There is a refreshing diversity in this running account of the years that Danny and the boys spent together. There are the schemes which they conceive to turn a dollar, honest or otherwise, the pranks which they play on each other and on the townspeople, and through it all runs a truly American feeling for the rights of the individual, no matter how bizarre or eccentric he may sometimes be. The author has caught the genuine flavor of a backwoods life which is fast disappearing. Although written as fiction, Danny and the Boys is true Americana of a fresh and rollicking sort. To Annie Isabella. Forward. The following stories of Hungry Hollow mainly concern the fabulous doings of Danny and the boys who live there. Hungry Hollow lies on the rugged Upper Peninsula of Michigan, midway between Lake Superior and the iron mining town of Chippewa. Before Danny and the boys came to the hollow, it was the site of a white pine logging camp. Prior to that, the Indians used to dwell there. That was before the heap-big white man came and drove the Peninsula Indians away, nearly exterminating them for their bad taste in fighting for their homes and for their freedom. Before the Indians, there were the glaciers. These tales are written to celebrate and reaffirm the wonder and the glory of the individual man. Any shred of social significance that may have crept into this narrative is an accident for which I humbly apologize. If these stories must prove anything, perhaps it is simply this. In our time, there still dwells a group of men who live as they do because they choose to. Reflection may move one to conclude that this is no longer the common lot of mankind. Finally, to vary the formula a trifle, the characters and situations in this book are as real as Santa Claus. Robert Traver. Number 1, Hungry Hollow. The log cabin of Danny McGinnis and the boys stands on the side of a birch-covered slope where the Mulligan Plateau abruptly shears off into the valley of the Big Dead River. The front door of the camp faces west, and occasional gleaming patches of the river show through the dense tag-alder thickets and spruce-bottom lands which mark its winding course. A portion of this swampy lowland knifes into the slope just north of the camp. It is in this little swamp that Danny hides his moonshine still. A quarter of a mile north of the camp stands the edge of the tall Silver Lake hardwood. Behind the camp to the east rises a series of rough wooded terraces to the top of the Mulligan Plateau. This plateau runs east as far as the eye can see, bounded on the north by the Silver Lake hardwood, and on the south, a mile away, by the tumbling Mulligan Creek, beyond which looms the brooding Mulligan Mountain Range. The Mulligan Plateau, with its miles of charred white pine stumps and lonely sentinel trees, standing amidst the tangle of sweet fern and huckleberry bushes, looks like a great unkempt burial ground. This is the home of Danny and the boys of Hungry Hollow. The manner in which Hungry Hollow acquired its name has become lost in the mists of local legend. Danny's place stands on the wind-protected side of a hill, not in a hollow. As for the Hungry part, the place had once been the main Dead River camp of old Angus Ferguson, one of the Upper Peninsula's fabulous lumber barons. Graybeards allowed that one winter in the 80s the snow had been so deep, the storms so lashing, and the cold so bitter that for over a month supplies could not be brought in. The camp hunters found that the deer had perished in their swampy winter yards, and that when relief finally came, not a single horse was left in the camp. Dark rumor had it that forever after that the lumberjacks of Hungry Hollow had to be shod by a blacksmith. Danny McGinnis, then a beardless youth, was one of the survivors of that desperate winter. He was a chore boy or bull cook for the camp cook, and he was curiously loath to admit that he had ever partaken of horseflesh. "No, we didn't eat no bloody horses," Danny scoffed. "What really happened was me and the cook run clean out of mushrooms. Would you believe it? Them bloody high-toned lumberjacks went into a pout and wouldn't eat their porterhouse steaks nor nothing that they was smothered in mushrooms. It's as true as I'm settin' here." Old Angus Ferguson. This terrible red-bearded Scotch giant had dedicated a lifetime to ravishing the peninsula of its white pine. He was called the King of the White Pine. People said he leered ecstatically as he drove his team of prancing bays through the dreary miles of his barren cuttings. At one time he was reputed to be a millionaire, although he had never owned more than 40 acres of timberland. How did he do it? Danny would say, spitting a rich stream of peerless juice. It was dead simple. All he done was buy 40 acres at Hungry Hollow and log all around it for 17 winters. Yep. But finally all the white pine had been cut, and old Angus had gone broke while trying to log the Mulligan Mountains and sustain a menagerie of wives all at the same time. He had died penniless at the turn of the century, cleaning spittoons and cadging drinks in George Volker's saloon in Chippewa. Chippewa, the iron mining town which lay some 17 miles south of Hungry Hollow. All that he left behind him was endless miles of charred white pine stumps. A woodpecker'd have to pack his lunch to fly across it, Danny said. A brood of red-headed children, and the tumbling ruins of the main camp at Hungry Hollow. Danny had appointed himself the sole heir of old Angus, and had acquired Hungry Hollow and its ruined buildings by the simple expedient of moving in. He had lived there ever since. Hungry Hollow finally reverted to wilderness. With the exception of Danny and the boys, only an occasional hunter or trapper or fisherman came along that way. No longer does the river valley echo with the tumult and shouting of the spring drive. The mighty torrent of the Big Dead River continues to spill out of Silver Lake and restlessly search its way eastward to Lake Superior, finally joining its icy waters just north of Iron Bay, the county seat of Iron Cliffs County. The Big Dead flows on and on, as it did when the Clan Ferguson foraged for food with the aid of clubs, and just as it will continue to flow when men have at length disappeared from the battered earth, have hurled their last bolts of hate and fear at each other across the screaming skies. Hungry Hollow is, in its way, one of the most exclusive clubs in America. There are no officers or directors in the usual sense. Old Danny McGinnis is tacitly the president, king, treasurer, chef, imperial potentate, grand wizard, and official barkeep, all rolled into one. Nor are there any rules or dues or membership committees. No ritualistic mumbo-jumbo or secret hand clasps or blackballs or any of the other dazzling paraphernalia of male exclusiveness. Decisions are arrived at in Hungry Hollow by a silent nod of the head. "Well, it's Saturday again," Dan might observe. "Will we go to town tonight and have a few snorts and maybe visit Big Annie and the girls? What say, boys?" There is usually a brief period when the boys discuss the problem. Then comes the quick nod or a negative shake of the head. The majority rules. There is little debate and no appeal. Elementary democracy flowers at Hungry Hollow. Big Buller Bodine was the first to move in with Danny. That was the summer the First World War flamed over Europe. Big Buller, who drove a local dray, had devoted himself that summer to a vain attempt to consume all the alcohol in Chippewa. It was a losing battle. He finally sought the solace of the forest. The sun was going down as Buller, like a lone elephant going out to die, lurched along the river ridge, following the winding, sandy, two-rut road down the slope to Hungry Hollow. Danny met him at the door as Buller shambled up the knoll to the camp. "Hello," Danny said, his darting gray eyes surveying the vast alcoholic wreck that swayed before him. "Thinks I, you're Buller Bodine, ain't you? What's left of him, I mean." Buller looked at Danny with his inflamed bloodhound eyes. His soiled clothes hung loosely on his great frame. "Look, Danny," he croaked, "look, just let me stay out here till I die. It won't take a whole lot of time. Please, Danny. I don't want to up and die in there with all them people watching me." Buller swept his arm vaguely to the south in the general direction of Chippewa. Danny folded his thin, powerful arms loosely across his sweat-stained suspenders. He raised his bald head and spat sightlessly into the sunset. He said. He looked at Buller. He spat again and then curtly nodded his head. Buller was in. "Come on in and have a wee drink of moonshine before we eat," Danny said. "I just run off a fresh batch this morning. I'm having mulligan stew for supper. Lucky for you, you happened along." Yep. In his grotesque eagerness, Buller stumbled across the threshold of the camp and nearly fell flat on his face. "Steady there, me lad," Danny warned sharply. "Don't rush, don't crowd. The bloody moonshine'll keep. It always has." "Boy, oh boy," Buller exclaimed huskily, falling into a chair at the oilcloth-covered table and rolling his red eyes up at Danny in an expression of deathless gratitude. Gentle Timmy was the next member of Hungry Hollow to be taken in. Little, wiry, lean-wristed Timmy Pasco, a timid pocket edition of old Danny. Timmy with the soft brown eyes. Timmy, the self-taught mechanical genius who had once worked for a tinkerer called Henry Ford before the latter's name had become a household word. Proud Timmy, the gassed veteran of the First World War, who scornfully spurned his veteran's disability pay, and who had returned from overseas with the bitter resolve never to work again, to punch a goddamn clock, as long as he remained on Earth. He had lived in a crude log shack and trapped in the vicinity of Hungry Hollow for nearly a year before Danny and Buller were sure he was there. He moved through the woods like a wraith, canoeing the Big Dead and its tributaries, trapping and fly-fishing like one possessed, shunning all company, going into Chippewa only for necessary supplies and to dispatch his furs. One morning at breakfast time he had appeared at Hungry Hollow with 2 shimmering rainbow trout. "Here," he said, presenting them to Danny. "I just caught 'em." He then timidly asked Danny and Buller if he could borrow an old newspaper or magazine with a crossword puzzle in it. Timmy took a boundless delight in working crossword puzzles. Danny found an armload of back copies of the Hematite, the Chippewa weekly newspaper. Timmy stood wistfully examining Danny's behorned and earphoned battery radio set. "Does it play?" he inquired. "No," Danny replied. "I don't know what in the hell's the matter with the damn thing. Won it in town a year ago Christmas on a punchboard at Charlie's place." "Thinks I it's the battery's flat." Danny scowled. "Someday, if I ever find the time, I'm going to yank the fallopian tubes out of that goddamn cabinet and make a tool chest. Yep, if I ever find the bloody time." "Do you mind if I look at it?" Timmy said. In 10 minutes, with the aid of a pair of Danny's 10-cent store pliers, the camp was flooded with hillbilly laments and laxative ads. "How is your stomach?" the radio announcer bawled. Timmy had saved the little radio from its ignominious fate as a tool chest. "What you fellows really need is a wind charger for your storage batteries," he had ventured timidly, getting up his newspapers to depart. Danny had looked at Buller, and Buller had looked at Danny. "Do you have an acid stomach?" the announcer persisted. What Hungry Hollow had needed for a long time was a first-class jack-of-all-trades. Not that Danny and Buller couldn't fix radios and wind chargers and simple things like that, but they were usually far too busy with more important concerns, making moonshine whiskey and home brew, or playing endless games of cribbage, or planning trips to Chippewa, or recovering from their last visit to town. Danny and Buller nodded at the same time. Danny cleared his throat. "Don't be in no rush to leave, Timmy," he said, hospitably bobbing his eyebrows and mustaches. "Stick around for a while. Maybe you can help us to put up our goddamn wind charger. Don't be in no bloody hurry." "Do you suffer from bloat and stomach gas?" the radio shouted. Timmy had not been in a hurry. He was back that evening with his pack-sack, his canoe beached at the Big Dead pool below the camp. Within a year, Hungry Hollow had a towering new propeller-bladed wind charger. Timmy even built a brand-new radio out of old tin cans and rusty button hooks, Danny liked to boast, and put a new tar-paper roof on the camp, spaded a potato patch, built a new log outhouse, and even soldered and repaired Danny's battered still. There seemed to be nothing he could not do. All he needed for inspiration was a constant supply of crossword puzzles. He tied his own flies, repaired and wound his own fly rods, and kept the camp supplied with fresh brook trout and rainbows from the Big Dead. Yep, Danny said to him one day, reflectively stroking his corded throat. I've et so goddamn many fish since you come here, I'm developing gill slits. It's as true as I'm settin' here. Nearly 10 years had passed before any new members were taken into Hungry Hollow. A number of wistful candidates had appeared, but they had somehow failed to win the nod. Danny was nearing 70, and a strange tidal wave known as the Depression was engulfing the land. Borne upon its muddy crest were two bewildered refugees called Nicholas Vedder and Swan Kellstrom. Taconite Nick Vedder had been born in Chippewa years before. They had landed in Chippewa from Minnesota, riding the rods of a freight train on the Lake Superior and Chippewa Railway. They had found their way to the local hobo jungle near the roundhouse on the edge of town. There they had partaken well, but not too wisely, of a hobo drink known as canned heat. Under its mellifluous glow they had reeled and lurched about downtown Chippewa until one of Chippewa's dismounted police had tenderly guided them to the jail under the city hall. The next morning, the local justice of peace, Judge Williams, had sentenced them each to pay $10 fine and $3.15 costs, or to serve 30 days in the county jail down at Iron Bay. It might just as well have been $1 million. "We will go to Yale," Swan had gleefully told the judge, happy over the prospect of a month's freedom from cold and hunger, but the good judge had thought otherwise. The county jail was crowded. Men virtually waited in line to gain admission to the place. No, the judge would suspend the sentence if they would leave town immediately. "Move on" had become the order of the day, the byword of a bewildered and tramping nation. Such was the homecoming of Taconite Nicholas Vedder, whose restless wanderings about the mining camps of America had led him to Houghton, Ironwood, Chisholm, Coleraine, Hibbing, the Black Hills, Butte, Montana, then back to Taconite, Minnesota, where he had got his name, and finally back to Chippewa, where his father had been an iron miner before him. Dusk found Taconite and his chum, Swan Kellstrom, a native of Minnesota, trudging along the ridge toward Hungry Hollow. As a boy, Taconite had heard of Angus Ferguson and had fished the Big Dead River. He even remembered Danny McGinnis. Perhaps the logging camp was still running. Perhaps they could get a job cutting white pine. "But it's all used stumps," Swan said, skeptically surveying the ravaged Mulligan plain. "Do you know even if the camp is still there?" Swan had learned to be watchful of Taconite's judgment. He had discovered that his mental processes were inclined to be a little slow. "See," Taconite exclaimed in his gobbling, extravagant voice. "See the light in the window? Old Ferguson'll sure give us a job, gee whiz." But old Ferguson had been dead for over 30 years. It was Danny McGinnis who met them at the door, who served them steaming helpings of mulligan stew out of the big iron kettle, and after glancing at Buller and Timmy and getting their nods, pointed out the empty upper bunk where they might spend the night. For there were jealously guarded temporary admissions to Hungry Hollow for the lone trapper, the hungry wayfarer, for the down and out. The next morning, grateful Swan and Taconite had sallied forth with saw and axes, and cut and sawed and chopped enough hardwood firewood to last a month. They had the whole Silver Lake forest to work on. It was so late when they had finished that they naturally had to be fed and given another bed for the night. The next day, Taconite and Swan were so grateful that they again cut wood all day. Danny and the boys didn't have the heart to turn them out, and so it ran day after day, week after week, until the camp woodshed and temporary lean-tos were bulging with firewood, after which neat piles of wood began to dot the hillside like eccentric fortifications. The word finally got around Chippewa that Danny McGinnis had a wonderful store of firewood out at Hungry Hollow. Could he be persuaded to sell some? He could. "Choice firewood for sale, dirt cheap at Hungry Hollow," ran the ad in the Hematite Weekly, composed by Timmy, whose crossword puzzles naturally made him the camp's undisputed intellectual. "Come and get it. D. McGinnis, proprietor," the ad concluded. Danny's buckskin purse began to swell with the proceeds from the sale of wood. Taconite and Swan toiled on and on, cutting wood like avenging angels. Verily, they would hew their way to economic security. During their absence one Saturday, Danny and Buller and Timmy had a formal meeting. To nod or not to nod. When tired Taconite and Swan dragged themselves back to camp that night, Danny met them at the door and made the announcement. He held an open quart of Hungry Hollow moonshine in his hand. "Welcome to Hungry Hollow, boys," he proclaimed, genially rubbing his bald head. "Come on in and stay as long as you like." They had already been there 6 months. Number 2. Danny and the Boys. Scotch-Irish Danny had catapulted out of Canada when he was 17, reputedly chased by a bailiff who sought to find a husband for a country lass who needed one badly. Eventually landing in Chippewa, he went to work in one of the iron mines. Child labor laws were then the wistful dreams of long-haired eccentrics. After a few months underground, Danny quit the mine in disgust. For Danny was a natural-born sun-worshipper. "I'd sooner be in hell with my back broke," he told his boss one day, "but when I get there, I don't aim to dig my way down." He abruptly threw down his tools, snuffed out his candle, and walked away. He never mined another pound of ore. Instead, he went to work for old Angus Ferguson and nearly starved to death. And when Angus died, he moved into the old camp at Hungry Hollow, got himself a moonshine still, and permanently retired from all forms of gainful employment. Danny, who constantly maintained a miraculous 2-day growth of beard, had lively, darting little gray eyes, the permanently flushed countenance of an erring Santa Claus, and a remarkable set of tobacco-stained teeth, which he evidently thought had been given him for the sole purpose of removing beer-bottle caps. "Them bloody new-fangled bottle openers is always slippin'," he complained. Danny was one of those singular persons who seemed to have been born to be bald, who indeed would have looked ridiculous with a head of hair. He was never still. Nature had installed a great spring in the man and coiled it tightly for a long run. When animated, his eloquent eyebrows bobbed in synchrony with his mustaches. He blinked his eyes, ground his teeth, whinnied, sighed, shrugged, grimaced, protruded his chin, stroked his wire-haired whiskers, tugged at his mustaches, puffed out his cheeks, pulled them in, licked his lips, scratched himself, protruded his tongue, twisted his bald head, rubbed it, craned it, tilted it, and occasionally fell on it. Even in repose he was never still, loosely kneading his palms with his gnarled fingers, thumbs up, as though he were milking an invisible cow. And of course he talked to himself. "How come you're always talking to yourself?" Buller asked him testily one day, coming upon the old man mumbling to himself. Danny stroked his wire-haired chin reflectively. "For 2 reasons," he replied. "In the first place, I likes to hear a smart man talk, and in the second place, I likes to talk to a smart man. Yep. In his way, Danny was one of the most articulate men who had lived since Shakespeare. With a vocabulary limited to a few thousand words, a generous part of which was profanity, he nevertheless managed to communicate the most original ideas and subtlest emotions. He was a natural master of the rhythm and nuances of speech. He talked rapidly for the most part, constantly punctuating his words with staccato and peculiarly expressive yups. In short, Danny was a man of few words, but he used them over and over. He was also the poet laureate of invective. He could inject more feeling into a single goddamn than most poets could into an entire sonnet. He was a rustic genius, an illiterate spiritual offspring of Walt Whitman, an aging goat, a disorderly Pan, the last Adam, a one-man band. He was old Danny McGinnis of Hungry Hollow. Danny never tired of telling the boys about his brief experiences as an iron miner. The miners had then toiled long hours each day. 11 hours of savage amusement, he snorted. That was in the days before laborers grew soft and plaintive and began to think that perhaps 8 hours might be long enough for men to remain out of the sun. He invested the few months he had spent in the goddamn bowels of the earth with the dignity of a saga. He embellished his experiences until one marveled that he had survived. He had lived at a Cornish boarding house in Chippewa. One of his favorite stories about his earthy and rugged Cornish mining mates was the angling of Jan Tregembo. Jan was the husband of his boarding-house lady. With Jan, fits of melancholia regularly supplemented fits of drinking. The Sunday pasty dinner, the proverbial Cornish meat and suet pie, was served, but no Jan appeared for dinner. He had spent a bad Saturday night. Long-suffering Mrs. Tregembo wearily dispatched Dicker Matthews, her star boarder, to go out and find her missing husband. After a spell, Dicker returned and thoughtfully resumed eating his pasty. He seemed to have lost his appetite. Mrs. Tregembo emerged from the kitchen and asked Dicker if he had searched for her spouse. "Yes'm," Dicker replied. "I searched in the outhouse and in the bloody woodshed." "Did you find 'un?" Mrs. Tregembo asked. Dicker looked up at Mrs. Tregembo. He's hanging in the woodshed with a rope around his neck. Did you cut him down, Dicker? Mrs. Tregembo inquired. Cut him down, Dicker replied. How could I cut him down? The bloody booger weren't even dead yet. Yep, Danny usually concluded this account. The cousin Jacks is a mighty fine people, the greatest people on the face of the earth. Yep. But Harry Penhale was Danny's favorite Cornishman. Harry was Danny's working partner down in the mine. Along about midnight on the night shift, Harry liked to slip secretly up the ladder-way and scamper home and pay a brief visit to his young wife. The trick was not to be caught by the mining captain. In this way, Harry's pay was not docked, and the interlude made a fine break in the long evening's toil. He would surely have been discharged had he been discovered. One night Harry had returned from his nocturnal visit quite thoughtful, if not downright depressed. This was contrary to experience, as he usually regaled Danny with the glowing details of his truancy. Danny pondered the problem. What had happened? "Come on, old boy," curious Danny finally said. "Buck up. What's ailing you, lad? She mad at you?" Harry broke down and confessed. "When I got home, I tiptoed up the bloody stairs, and guess what?" "What happened?" Danny brightly inquired, licking his lips in vicarious anticipation. "What happened? Would you believe'n? There was the captain of our bloody mine in bed with Sarah," Harry replied in an awed voice. "What did you do to the bastard?" Danny demanded, his hackle rising. "Do to him?" Harry replied. "Lucky me snuck right back down the stairs and out the side door, and so help me, Danny, I don't really think he even seen me." Buller Bodine was born in Chippewa, of French-Canadian parentage. Until he had come to live with Danny, he had spent most of his life around horses and livery stables. He was a tremendous hulk of a man, splendidly equipped with a set of appetites to match his bulk. There were those hapless persons who had dared to call him fat. Retribution had been violent and swift, for Buller was as strong and hard as a blooded bull. "All over this goddamn peninsula," Danny said, "there's men roaming around on crutches, mumbling to theirselves and sleeping in depots and boxcars, what's called Buller Fatty. Yep. His girth was so great that Danny disciplined the boys at Hungry Hollow by threatening to make them run around Buller 10 times. "Either that or run clear down to the Mulligan Creek and back. Take your bloody pick now," Danny could warn. Slender little Timmy was of Cornish ancestry, with dark reddish hair and burning dark brown eyes. There was something indefinably genteel about him. Even dressed in his woods clothes, he somehow managed to suggest an aristocratic courtier. In him there was more than a little of the trace of the Spanish invaders who had long ago overrun Cornwall. Danny used to chide Timmy about his refined and gentle nature, especially when he refused to join the boys in their Saturday night excursions to Big Annie's. "The trouble with you, Timmy, I'm damned if you ain't afflicted awful with character. It's horrible and terrible." Taconite was part German, part Indian, and, according to Danny, part Norway pine. The man was gently mad about trees and wood-cutting. He would crouch on all fours to inhale the odor of the stump of a freshly cut tree. "Ain't that a grand smell?" he'd sigh, shaking his dark cowlick from his eyes. Taconite took an inordinate pleasure in small things. After he and Swan had cut acres of hardwood, bare-handed, raising great calluses, Danny finally relented and bought each of them a pair of buckskin mittens. Taconite proudly wore his all the year round. "Gee whiz, these is swell mitts," he confided to the envious beholder. "They's warm in winter and cool in summer. Gee whiz!" Taconite had a large, pendulous goiter which gave his gobbling talk a breathless sort of quality. The night Danny presented the new mitts, he stood closely watching Taconite as he postured before the little camp mirror, clapping the mittens delightedly before him. "That Taconite's a mighty fine-looking fella," Danny mused aloud. Yep. He could have been in moon pictures if his forehead wasn't all used up by his hair." Swan Kellstrom had turned out to be a golden find for Hungry Hollow. It had developed that he was a marvelous cook. Sometime in his restless drifting about his native Minnesota, he had been, among many other things, a baker in Duluth.